Welcome to our class. This week we will look at control statements with respect to form processing. A control statement is essentially a statement that determines whether other statements will be executed or not. An if and a switch statement can decide whether to execute another statement or decide which of two or more statements to execute. Loops generally decide how many times to execute another statement. Some of the concepts that we need to understand before we look at control statements are what are called equality and identity operators, relational operators, logical operators. We will then go into our if-else statements, the switch statement, and the various loops. In PHP, we have three equality operators, and although they're called equality, they're actually more of a comparison. The equal is essentially saying, are they the same? However, it could also mean, are they equal? The exclamation equal, not equal, and the less than, greater than is also a symbol for not equal. We have what are called identity operators, and they include a type comparison. And they are the three equals, the exclamation, and the two equals. So that extra equal on the end is also comparing the type rather than just the surface value of whatever you are comparing. The equality operators will sometimes automatically perform a type coercion, meaning they will decide what type of type is being compared. And here's some examples under which this happens. Comparing a null to a string, what it will do is convert the null to an empty string. Comparing a string to a number, it will convert the string to a number. Converting numeric strings, meaning the numbers are in quotes, it will convert them to numbers. So these are some things you need to be aware of, because here again, PHP is a loosely typed language. The identity operators do not perform type coercion because we are comparing the type in addition to the surface value of the variable. There are some unusual results that can occur with this equality operator, and you can look at these in the book. Relational operators. These are also called comparison operators, and they are listed in the order of precedence. For example, less than or equal to, greater than or equal to. Here's the equalities. Equal, not equal. These are still a comparison or a relationship. Ampersand, ampersand for and the pipe symbol twice for an or. These are pretty much the same in every language. They should be familiar to you. Okay, so here's an example. 1 is less than 3, which is a string, will return true. And it's interpreting the type, and it's looking at the 3 as a number. So when you're comparing strings to numbers, it generally will interpret the string as a number, provided that it looks like a number. When you're comparing strings, what it does, it compares them based on their ASCII value. So here, apple is less than orange. It returns true because in the ASCII chart, A comes first. Uppercase letters are on top of the chart, so to speak, and so that will return true in this condition. Just something to be aware of, because in PHP you can compare strings. There are some unusual results with relational operators when comparing with 0 and a string variable. It will convert the string to 0. So take a look at some of these. They are in the book. Our logical operators, not, and or. For conditions involving and, both or several must match. For conditions involving or, one or the other must match. And here we have the order of precedence, which includes both our logical and relational operators. So there is some type of ordering system, unless you enclose your expression with parentheses to dictate the order of precedence. The basic if conditional statement, here we have if the condition is true, the code inside the curly braces will be executed. If only one statement is to be executed, you are allowed to write this statement without the curly braces. I do not advise that. I think the curly braces should be there to help your code be more readable. However, this is valid in PHP. Here we have an if-else. So if the condition evaluates to be true, the code will be executed here. Else, meaning the condition is not true, the code inside the curly braces for the else will be executed. And notice I say not true because it's more correct to look at it from that perspective as opposed to thinking false. If there is only one statement to be executed for each condition, the curly braces are not required. Here is an if statement with one if-else clause, meaning we can evaluate more than one condition. So if the first condition is true, this code will be executed. Else, if this condition is true, this code will be executed. In PHP, else if can be 2 words or it can be 1 word. In most languages, you see that as 2 words, I believe, and this is my preferred choice. One thing about an if-else, the first time we return true, we exit out of the statement and continue on. And here we have several else-ifs. You will commonly see a final else. So if none of the above are true, the final else will execute. A switch is another way with different comparisons and different outcomes. So here, the condition to be evaluated, in this case it's a variable, and the first time we find a match, the statement will execute, and then we have a break. If this is not a match, the next case will be tested, the statement will be executed, and then we have a break, etc. Here again, you should be using a default. In the event that none of the above are true or match, this statement will be executed. So this is our switch syntax. While loops. A while loop executes the code as long as the conditional statement is true. So there has to be some kind of a statement in here that is evaluated to true. So it will continue to loop through and execute a statement as long as the condition is true. A do-while loop is essentially the same as a while loop, with the exception that the condition is at the end. Therefore, it will always execute at least once. A for loop is used when you know or can determine how many times to execute code. And in this case, you would always have a counter, a condition, and then an increment. And here again, the statement to be executed as long as this condition is true based on the counter. A for each loop is commonly used with arrays, also used to loop through database records. And in the example that I have here, we are using it to display the name-value pairs in our form with the $_post array. So here we have for each. This is our array as $key is to $value. These are variable placeholders, and they essentially represent the name-value pairs, commonly called key-value pairs. Here again, this works with our associative array. It is not, and here we can echo back the values. This is an easy way of iterating through your form values. I would like to point out working with checkboxes in the HTML form as an array. Rather than using the word food as a name to indicate a group of checkboxes, meaning there are more than one checkboxes sharing the same name, we can put the brackets after them in the HTML. This seems to be unique to PHP. Other languages may not do that. I'm just pointing this out. However, if we were to do this, we could use $_post and pass it the value of food. Now it knows this is an array, and using our for each loop, we can loop through, and here I'm just echoing out the values because we know the name is food. So this is a way of working with checkboxes in the HTML form. There are other ways that we will learn, and we will cover them when we cover arrays. I would also like to point out the print_r function. It's very handy for displaying the contents of an array. Here I am using it to output the name value pairs in $_post. This one line of code will do that. This is a nice function just to see that everything is returning values. Some other useful functions that are in the other videos with respect to working with forms, and we have already looked at, is set. Applies to predominantly checkboxes and radios, which check for the existence of a variable, meaning if a variable value has been set. Empty checks for an empty string, and it will return true if the variable is empty, null or is not set. So technically empty can be used, it is very similar to it as set, except that it does a little bit more than is set. The count function will return the number of elements in an array, and we have the inArray function where if you pass it a parameter, it can return the value for that key. And I have examples of using these in my form demonstrations. So let's just take a look at the count function, and it also happens that we're looking at not empty. So here we have an if, not empty, $_post food. This is our checkbox, which is an array. So if it's not empty, we're going to essentially use a for loop, showing you how to use a for loop here. And in order to do that, we need a number. Remember, for loops work with numbers. So here I can use the count function, pass it a parameter, $_post food, and it's going to count the number in that array, which would be 3. I store it in this variable here, and here's my initialized counter starting at 0, and here's my condition, I is less than $num, which is the number, and then we increment.